Hi, Professor.
Hello. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. I thought we'd start at the end today in terms of the weekly haiku essay, and then we'll get on with our basic Buddhism. But we still have a few minutes. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take questions at this point.
Oh, yeah, I have a question. So last time we talked about, you did mention Dalai Lama a few times. I'm just wondering, have you been to Tibet, Professor?
No, I have not been to Tibet, but I'm a big fan of the Dalai Lama.
Oh, me too.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm very active on the situation in Tibet. Like, yeah, I'm very aware of it. Yeah, I try to study as much as I can about Tibet. 7 Years Tibet, one of my favorite movies.
Mm.
I have friends that went to Tibet, and they would tell me before I go to Tibet, I need to make sure I'm in good health because once we get up to Tibet, we could experience some health problems, regardless if we're young or old, because of it's really high up there.
Yes, yes. And native Tibetans have enlarged hearts. That's how they can tolerate that kind of situation.
Oh, right, I heard about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, some years ago, I had a student who had actually studied, he was Tibetan, he studied with the Dalai Lama. He did his master's thesis with me, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Quite interesting.
I think I remember the Dalai Lama did come to SDSU like several years ago. Did you get a chance to meet him, Professor?
I didn't get the chance to meet him, but I was in the audience. It was very interesting.
A friend in UCSD said that when Dalai Lama went to speak there, they would hold out signs that if you want to take a picture of Dalai Lama, don't post it online or else you cannot enter China. I heard something about that.
I didn't see any signs, but I think that's probably wise advice, unfortunately.
I'm banned from entering China, so if I get a picture of him, it'll be fine.
That's one good thing to look forward to.
Yeah, last year after taking part of the protests in Hong Kong and all the stuff I posted on WeChat against Xi Jinping, I found out that WeChat suspended my account for a month, saying I was posting inappropriate things, and they gave me a warning if I ever do it again, they'll permanently ban my WeChat account. So that was very weird.
New ways of using technology to control people.
Yep.
It's sad.
Yeah, and yeah, during the Cultural Revolution in China, they destroyed many Buddhist temples and ancient artifacts in China. That was just really sad.
It was, yes.
My father had to. My father's originally from Guangzhou, and because of the Cultural Revolution, he had to legally swim to Hong Kong for a better life because yeah, they were starving people, and the Red Guards were just like killing people who would speak against the government.
Mm-hmm. The Cultural Revolution was a very terrible time there.
Mm-hmm.
I have some friends who are scholars now in teaching in the States who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. It's very difficult to get an education at that time. Very difficult.
Yeah. After when they made 7 Years Tibet, they actually had to keep it a secret from China, and then they found out the Chinese government were not happy, and I heard the director and Brad Pitt, they are banned from entering China for life.
Ugh. Well, I haven't been there myself for quite a few years. I don't think it's the best possible place to go, even for a philosophy conference.
Oh, right, right. But now I can't even go back to Hong Kong. So the only place that's Chinese place not technically not Chinese. I'm trying to find the right word for it. Taiwan. That's the only place I could go.
Yes.
But I love Taiwan.
It's a very unique place. I enjoy it there
Mhm.
very much. Sorry, I wasn't able to go there this summer.
Oh yeah. But in Taiwan, it's pretty safe. I actually rather be there because they have the COVID-19 situation under control.
Yes. Yes. But I'm not so sure they would be happy to get someone coming from the United States.
Yeah.
Things are not so safe here.
Yeah. My my plan is to go to Korea to teach English for a couple years under the program called EPIC, and a few of my friends try to apply and they've been rejecting them. And from what they told me, Canadians have been accepted in a heartbeat, but not Americans.
Uh, that might have something to do with the virus. It's
Mhm.
unfortunate.
Oh, speaking of Korea, last year when I was studying abroad in Korea, I actually got a chance to celebrate Buddha's birthday at the what's that temple called again in Seoul? It's not in my head, but I did celebrate. It was Buddha's birthdays, and I got a chance to celebrate and saw a lot of performances, and yeah, it was great.
Yes, a very strong Buddhist culture in Korea, at least in
um,
the South.
yeah, yeah, and but also a lot of Christianity in South Korea as well.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
It's a very unique combination.
Right. Mm-hmm. We got a minute.
Students
Oh,
don't often realize that there are great distinctions between Chinese culture, Korean culture, Japanese culture. They think of it all as East Asia, but there's some very significant differences.
mhm. Yeah, in Asian studies, my main focus and interest is in Korea, mainly North Korea. That's
Mm,
been my interest ever since I started learning Korean 10 years ago.
mm, mm.
I have been to North Korea through the joint security area 3 times. I went
Oh.
inside the building, walked across, and said, I'm in North Korea, and then walked back to South Korea.
Uh,
It's it was kind of interesting seeing North Korea and seeing North Korean soldiers like staring at us with binoculars,
mm.
and the U.S. Army, which is our tour guide, would say, don't wave, point, or gesture at them, or else they'll take our picture and put it in the news saying American gesturing to us, and the United Nations will know, and it will be
Mm,
embarrassing.
mm.
I really enjoyed my time in Korea. That's why I want to move back for a couple years to teach English and also learn more about their history and culture.
Yes. I was only there once, but South Korea is a very beautiful place. Just
Mm,
the natural scenery is just beautiful.
yeah, but I don't know when I could even go there now because of the pandemic.
Yes. Well, I think we'll get started because we do have the recording, and if people join us late, they can go back and check that. I wanted to start to make sure that people are clear on the assignments. So we're on week 2. So this is our second weekly haiku essay. So the first essay that we looked at, let's see if I can do that here. Last week, we're starting by trying to check what your perceptions are. So last week's essay asked you to think about a particular quote, which comes from the Heart text, and how you interpret what's happening there, how you analyze it and apply it, and why it is philosophically significant. So this week, we're also looking at perceptions. And at this point, having had 4 sessions after today on Buddhism, what do you see as Buddhism? So again, checking what your changing perception of Buddhism is, and put it in a kind of a definition format. What does that mean? So what is the meaning of that perception of Buddhism? What does it include? And then what makes this philosophically significant? So what is it that Buddhism as a philosophy can contribute to the field of philosophy as a whole? So that this question is going to be at the end of today's PowerPoint, but I wanted to make sure that people are clear about it. Again, the first 3 essays are going to be due with a hard deadline, but that won't be until next week. So if there's any questions about that, just let me know. So everybody clear about what you're doing with these essays. Want to keep them around 500 words and rely on the material we have so far. You can also use any material in the Vipassana text, the heart text, because you should be coming to an end in terms of the reading, since it's only about 100 pages. And then next week we have an essay by Professor Inada that we're going to be looking at in a very detailed way. Okay. So any questions here?
I don't have a question about this haiku essay, but I just wanted to say that the week 2 commentary doesn't have an upload button for the
Oh, it
song.
doesn't. Oh, okay. I put it in like the others. So thanks for letting me know. I'll check that out after class today and see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to stop this one and go over to our basic Buddhism. Oh, I also did send out an announcement. I found PDFs, or at least access to PDFs of 2 more of our textbooks. So I posted those. I sent them as an announcement by email, and I also put them on Canvas. So I'm hoping that these might help people out who are having trouble getting hold of them. So I don't know if anybody tried them, checked out those links. I tried to download them, but I wasn't able to do that. I was able to download the Vipassana text PDF, but these are PDFs, but you have to, I think, view them on screen. So let me know if there's any questions or concerns about those texts. We're not going to be getting to them for a few more weeks. Okay, so today we're going to continue trying to get a foundation in Buddhism. As I said, in this class, people come to Buddhism from a variety of backgrounds, and I want to make sure that people are clear on what is basic. So we're going to take a look at the who, what, how, and why of Buddhism. Some of this material crosses over some of our discussions last time. I want you to be aware of certain problematic terminology. This was included in last week's PowerPoint, but we didn't really have time to spend on too much on it. The whole notion of self and soul, you might find even in Buddhist texts mention or use of these words, but in fact, neither one of these is consistent with Buddhist philosophy. The notion of self, particularly ego self, is a social construct, and soul is also a social construct. So even though people might use those words and even go into words like spirit or spirituality, in order to have spirituality, technically you should have a spirit, and a spirit is like a soul, and that's not something that is recognized as real. It's a perception that people have, but it's not consistent with Buddhist concepts. Reincarnation is also quite often assumed to be part of Buddhist philosophy, and it is something that many practitioners of Buddhism believe in, but again, thinking of it in terms of philosophical terms, there is no such thing as reincarnation because of the first point, that there is no self or soul to reincarnate. This is going to be covered next week in Inada's article, so he'll talk about why There, philosophically speaking, is no such thing as reincarnation in Buddhism. Last time we addressed the issue of whether Buddhism is closer to religion or science, and I tried to make the argument that it is much more like a science than it is a religion. But again, people will refer to it as a religion, and classes are taught in Buddhist religion. So it's not that people don't perceive it that way or practice it that way, but in this class, we're interested in the philosophical aspect. Desire is also considered problematic. I found over the years that American students in particular like to hang on to their desires, and so they are rather unhappy when they find out that desires are something considered attachments in Buddhism. But it's part of what we saw in the Fourfold Noble Truth, the notion of desire as tana, or thirst, something that you are dependent on, and that is what holds us back. And also the notion of salvation. Again, you will find Buddhist texts that use this term, but there is no one to be saved, as we will see when we get to the Diamond Sutra. So people easily slip into the terminology, but we're trying to be precise in a philosophical way. The same applies to this last chain of ways in which enlightenment is described as something to be attained or obtained or achieved or reached, but it's not something out there. It's just a shift in our perception or our attention or our awareness. So it's not something you have to go out and get. You already have the capacity for awakening. Even if you're sleeping in your bed at night, you have the capacity to awaken, but you just happen to be in sleep mode. And sleep itself comes in different forms, such as deep sleep and REM sleep and light sleep. So I just want to alert you to these terms, which have been used and misused in a Buddhist context. And when we're being very careful in a philosophical way, we have to see whether or not they are consistent with the actual philosophical teaching of Buddha. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, looks like we got some chats. Some Buddhists do, in fact, believe in reincarnation, but it is inconsistent with Buddhist philosophy. And as I've said, Professor Inada will outline the argument for why that is the case. So that doesn't mean that people who practice Buddhism are going to stop talking about it. And what I find when I teach the students, particularly the ones who are the nuns, and how they interact with lay people who come, when you're at the entry level, it might be very helpful, a form of upaya or skillful means, to talk to people about the idea of reincarnation. But as they go along, remember, great faith has to be replaced by great doubt. So everything that you thought you knew about Buddhism, even as a practitioner, has to be treated with skepticism when you get to stage 2. And stage 3 is the great death of delusion, which goes even further. So we're going to be tracing that through the text in this class. But of the 3, we're mostly interested in great doubt. Okay, so who? The Buddha is the one who woke up. That's literally what the title refers to. I'm sure you all have seen these images of the Buddha. I chose this one because we see his mudra, that is his hand gesture, which is the hand gesture for fearlessness. So his right hand is demonstrating wisdom or representing wisdom, and the left hand represents samadhi, or a form of contemplation, a form of meditation. It's also sometimes known as the drunken elephant stopping mudra, because there's a story about the Buddha who was confronted by an elephant that had been made drunk by his cousin, Devadatta, who was trying to assassinate the Buddha so he could take over the Sangha. That's a whole different story. And this drunken elephant is rampaging towards him, and the Buddha uses this mudra to calm him down. Now, we don't necessarily have to think of this in terms of drunken elephants, but I think it is the rampaging mind that needs to be calmed down. And what this mudra actually does is remove fear by means of wisdom and practice. So there are things that we're going to talk about, like the self as a social construct, which people can find very objectionable and fearful, that Buddha wants us to lose ourselves, but he only wants us to lose the delusion of self. Our true sense of identity is actually our Buddha nature, as we'll see. So to remove fear, you need a combination of wisdom and practice. So this is associated with the teaching of the doctrine of Dharma, because sometimes, as I said, the content seems to be very radical and therefore something people are resistant to. So maybe a contemporary translation would be chill. You don't have to worry about this. We're going to discuss it and build up wisdom through practice. That combination will relieve that sense of fear, that sense of losing one's identity and so forth. So these are two different versions of that. Any questions? But if you see a drunken elephant, don't try this, because you have to be a Buddha in order to make it work. These are some more different mudras. Mudras do not originate in Buddhism. They existed prior to that in Vedic religion. There's the dispelling fear, meditation, teaching, wisdom, preaching the law, or the Dharma. We already saw calling the earth to witness. That was in the Battle for Buddha's Brain PowerPoint. So when you see a statue of the Buddha, you can see the symbolism that is being shown by the mudras. And then there are different postures, standing, walking, sitting, reclining, and seated positions. So these are all different ways, not just for the Buddha to interact, but Buddhist practitioners. So he's an historical person.
What do these do exactly?
Oh, that's just a way. It's kind of like body language that you're showing what you're doing at that moment. So if you're preaching the law, then you are not just using words, but you're also using your body gestures.
Professor. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I got it.
Ah, okay.
Well, yeah, the reclining photo of the Buddha, most of the temples I visit that showed him doing that, and that's depict him the day he died. Am I right?
Yes, yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay. Does that like always depict the death of the Buddha, or no?
It could also just be that the Buddha is sleeping, so that this seems to be the posture that monastics would assume when they went to sleep.
Okay, I remember I also saw several photos with the Buddha lying down, and he was surrounded by several people, and it's always depicted the day he died.
Yes, so that very often is the meaning behind that kind of depiction. But at the same time, it's not considered fearful or something that's intrinsically negative. Death is just a natural process.
Right. I got it. Thank you.
Okay, so as we talked last week, or I guess it was on Tuesday, we can date the Buddha from around the 6th century BCE. He was a prince known as Gautama Siddhartha, also referred to as Shakya Muni. Shakya was his tribe. Muni means a sage. So when there are in Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, multiple Buddhas, and you want to talk about the historical Buddha from the 6th century, then he's often referred to as Shakya Muni Buddha to distinguish him from other Buddhas of the past or the present or even the future. And around age 29 is when he abandoned his so-called normal life as a prince, headed towards becoming king of the realm, and started asking today what we might call existential questions. So he's a role model in Buddhism. He's a teacher, he's a preacher, he's a therapist, he's a philosopher, and he's also a social reformer. That aspect is not discussed quite as often, but he was very early on opposed to the caste system. He completely disregarded it. And even today, there are remnants of the caste system that you find in India, but it is completely inconsistent with his notion of egalitarianism, where there are no hierarchical distinctions, not just between human beings, but between sentient beings. But he's not a god, and he's not a divine being. So he's very often presumed to be that, or he is depicted in a way that leads people to think that he's presented as a god. And I remember one of the first sessions I had when I was teaching the nuns in the Taiwan Buddhist college, and I told them, well, you know, my students think that when you go into the temple and you bow in front of the Buddha, that you're worshiping him as a god. And their response was just uproarious laughter. They thought that was so funny that anyone would think that that was the case. So it shows reverence, it shows respect, but it's not saying that the Buddha is a god. In fact, as they said, they want to be like the Buddha. So that does not mean they want to be God, they want to be awakened. So later on in the evolution of Buddhist philosophy, we have an expansion of the notion of the Buddha from just an historical person to becoming a universal principle of awakening. So that's the Buddha that we'll see when we get to the Lotus Sutra, for example. In the suttas, the early texts, the Buddha is this historical figure who is communicating with and dialoguing with particularly his students, but diverse groups of people. But later on, it becomes a more abstract notion. And the Buddha, even in the early texts, sometimes refers to himself as the Tathagata, meaning that he's not the only one. This literally means the thus come and the thus gone. Someone who is not attached to any particular place. And that Buddha nature is always abiding in the world. So even with the historical Buddha's death, that was not the end of Buddha nature in the world as we know it, because everyone has the same potential for Buddha nature. So it's a much more philosophically sophisticated notion of the Buddha. So potentially any and every being, not restricted to human beings, has that Buddha nature. So they can wake up to their inherent Buddha mind or Buddha nature. So these are terms that are particularly used in East Asian Buddhism. That's why I'm using the Chinese characters here. So what the Buddha is communicating is the Dharma in Sanskrit and Dhamma in Pali. And this is represented by the wheel of the Dharma, which has 8 points that represent the Eightfold Path. So this is the teaching or the message of the Buddha, what he woke up to, or what he woke up as, and we find it communicated in the suttas and the sutras, the texts.
Okay, sorry, I got a quick question.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a question in the chat that I believe is valid. About, well, I don't know, you can read it. About why do we study this Buddha and not the other Buddhas that have existed?
Well, actually, when we get to the Mahayana text, the other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas do become teachers and sources of information. In terms of historical Buddhism, where it starts with, that's why in the suttas, we have the talks of the historical Buddha. But at that time, his students were actually going out into the community and giving what they called Dharma talks. So he wasn't the only one who taught Buddhism, even in his own time. And as we'll see from the suttas, he's not really a person who lectures, but he interacts with his audience. So there's a flow of back and forth between the Buddha and the person who starts by asking him questions, and then the Buddha starts asking questions in return. So it's a very dynamic kind of a discussion that goes on. So in Mahayana Buddhism, they do recognize that there had been Buddhas prior to the time of the historical Buddha. And what they mean by that is Buddha nature didn't suddenly pop up in the 6th century BCE. Human beings always had that potential, but there could have been many people who had realized that potential, but because of historical conditions, this Buddha went on to develop his own community, the Sangha, and develop a form of teaching that was shared and passed on to others. So that would be the most obvious distinction between him and others who had previously awoken to their Buddha nature.
And when you're talking about Buddha nature, are you referring to reaching enlightenment or nibbana?
Well, your Buddha nature is your true identity. So we tend to think of our identity as our soul or as our ego self. But what the Buddha is saying, that we all share this Buddha mind among ourselves, not just human beings, but all sentient beings. And that's how we can interact in the most positive way with our environment and with reality. So what constitutes that Buddha mind? That's what we're going to be spending a lot of time trying to uncover.
Well, Professor, I have a question. So before St. Arthur went on his journey to reach enlightenment, from what I remember from Dr. Sandvik, St. Arthur, he went outside his kingdom. He saw a sick man, an old man, and a corpse. And the fourth person he saw was someone gaining enlightenment. Was that a Buddha that he saw?
No, that would have been someone who was following the Vedic religion. And contemporary scholars tend to think that that story was one of those narratives we put together. It's a plausible story, and that it probably didn't happen exactly that way. Because after the Buddha decided to go and seek reality, he didn't start with Buddhism, he started with Vedic religion. So he became a practitioner, an ascetic, and he did that for several years, and it didn't work. And that's where we found him under the Bodhi tree in the battle for the Buddha's brain, where he had walked away from the Vedic approach and decided to try his own. So he made use of the resources of his own time, and he found them to be a dead end.
Oh, because from what I remember, he was living in the forest for a while to try to gain enlightenment, and he was basically torturing himself, trying to detach himself from all his desires. Like, I remember Dr. Sandvik said that he left the kingdom, he left his wife and his newborn child in order to try to go on this journey.
Yes, so he was following a well-known spiritual path of the elite members of Indian society at the time. That's part of Vedic religion. So that was something that had been going on for hundreds of years, and they did meditation practices, ascetic practices, and the Buddha finally realized that this just isn't working. And that's when, after years of trying that, and as I said, hitting a wall, he started from scratch and came to his own realization. So that would be the beginning of Buddhism in terms of his own awakening. He did not become awakened while he was studying the Vedic religion.
Okay, because when you mentioned there were other Buddhas before Siddhartha, I thought the fourth person he met when he left the kingdom for the first time was a Buddha then.
No, that would have been, as the story describes it, it is a Vedic practitioner. That's why he decided, well, I'm going to try what that guy's doing.
Okay.
He's following a spiritual life, so I'm going to see if I can do the same thing, but it just didn't work out for him.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
So that actually fits in with this last comment, that his approach was a middle way between asceticism, which is what the Vedic religion taught, and hedonism, which was his previous life as a prince. So he had experienced both extremes. He had a very luxurious life in the palace, everything he possibly could want in order to satisfy his pleasures was there. And then he said, well, now there's something missing here. And he goes to the opposite extreme, which is asceticism. And that also didn't work. And so he finds the middle way between those two extremes. And that's the uniqueness of Buddhism. Something that had not been, at least publicized before. So in American terms, we've got the middle way between the libertine, something like Hugh Hefner and Playboy, and the Puritans, who are the exact opposite. And some people have argued we wouldn't have had Hugh Hefner if we hadn't had the Puritans. They're reacting to one another. So Hugh Hefner says, that kind of lifestyle of the Puritans, that's not good enough, so he goes to this other extreme. So either we have anarchy or we've got rigid law and order. So this, according to Buddhism, is a forced dualism. What Buddhism is interested in is non-dualism. You don't need to go to extremes. Both extremes have their deficiencies. There's something in between, something much better. And so we looked last time at the Fourfold Noble Truth about dukkha, the causation through tanha, and then ending the tanha to end the dukkha, and then the Eightfold Path. So that's everything we had looked at last time. Now, how is this to be accomplished? So this is another aspect that is unique. The Buddha decided, well, I did this on my own, but it probably would be more effective if we could get together as a group and people could provide a support network. And this is called the Sangha. So this is an example of a Chinese version of the Sangha. So it's a community of those who live in accordance with the Dharma. Originally, it seemed to refer to just the monks and the nuns. And then later, particularly in Mahayana, all practicing Buddhists are part of the Sangha. So there are basic guidelines, and they talk about these as the precepts. There's 5 basic guidelines for lay people, and another 5 are added on for monastics, so they have 10. Actually, there's hundreds when you become a monastic, but just to get started. And as you can see, they're just basic guides of how to live your life in a way that will make it easier for you to have the non-attachment that'll open the way for your awakening. So number 1, and this is something that was not unique to Buddhism, is ahimsa, non-injury to other beings. And that includes non-human beings as well. And that's why Buddhism develops in the direction of vegetarianism. Because in order to eat meat, you have to kill the animal from which the meat is going to come. Second, no stealing, no sexual misconduct. If you're a married person, sexuality within the context of marriage was acceptable, but if you're a monk or a nun, take a vow of celibacy, then there would be no sexual activity. No lying, no intoxicants, no vanity about appearance. So number 6 starts with the additional requirements for the monastics. No frivolous music, dancing, and entertainment, no luxurious beds, no eating beyond specified times, no wealth and ostentation, that is taking money and jewels. Now, what's very interesting about this is that the Buddha didn't sit down and write this list. The list evolved over time as they were living together in the Sangha, and they began to come across some problem areas. So, for example, the story is that one of the monks came from a very wealthy house. And so when he joined the Sangha, his parents brought him a nice bed. And then, of course, that created envy among the others. And so they decided, yeah, we got to make a note of that. No luxurious beds. People have to have basically the same kind of equipment. Same thing about no eating beyond specified times. In early India, they had their last meal at noon. That had a lot to do about the climate and the fact that they got up very early in the morning. When Buddhism moved to other kinds of climate where it was necessary to eat after noon because you couldn't survive, a place like Tibet, then there were modifications made. So these are flexible rules, rules that will make it easier for you to conduct your practice. So these are not divine laws that are being set forth. So any questions about these? As I said, there's a lot more, but these are just the basic ones. So we got a quote, sounds like Jesus and the whole Christian path. Actually, there does seem to be some possible influence between the Buddhists and the Christians, and especially somebody like Saint Francis of Assisi. There's a theory that he became a saint inspired by the Bodhisattva ideal that he had heard about. So in terms of how you become awakened, early on they decided that there were 3 different paths, that you could be a voice hearer, literally someone who hears the voice of the Buddha. So you would live in the Sangha with the Buddha and then have constant access to his teaching. But some people did what the Buddha did himself when he left the Vedic religion. They are self-initiators. And these are known as the Pratikya Buddhas. So they go off and meditate on their own. And there's a 3rd category called Bodhisattvas, who put others before themselves. So their vow is to save others and to postpone their own awakening until all beings can become awakened. So we'll be talking more about these, especially in the Lotus Sutra. So why? Why practice Buddhism? In addition to the discussions, or I don't want to call them lectures, but the dialogues with the Buddha in the early texts, there's a set of commentaries called the Abhidharma. So these are written by other people who are trying to elaborate on and explain the doctrines. So here we get the development of different philosophical concepts. So the construction of consciousness. What is the basis of not just human consciousness, but consciousness in general? So we'll be talking more about this. It's called the 5 skandhas. So your 5 sense organs plus your mind, so there's 6 senses, your sensations, your cognitive processing of sensations or concepts, your volitions or acts of will, which taken together create the construct of consciousness. So consciousness is not at the beginning of the process, it is a product of the process. So we'll be talking quite a bit more about this. Another doctrine is interconnectedness, pratitya samutpada. And I have a very interesting source to try to describe this, and it's actually Martin Luther King Jr., writing in 1967. And so he asks us to consider how we are connected to one another. Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning, go to the bathroom, reach for the sponge, and it's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. Now, does he mean that a Pacific Islander is there in your bathroom? What is he actually saying?
He's saying that in order to have that soap or to have that sponge, you have to depend on the entire, like some person in the Pacific Islands contributed to the creation of that sponge.
Okay, so things come to us from a variety of places, and today even more so because of globalization. So you reach for the bar of soap, it's given to you by a Frenchman. You go into the kitchen, you drink your coffee, poured into the cup by a South American. Or maybe you want tea, poured by a Chinese. Or cocoa for breakfast, and then the cup is poured by the West African. You reach for your toast, given to you by an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. So there's all these people who are really intrinsic to your everyday lifestyle. We depend on each other. There is interdependence. So not just depending as a one-way street, but a mutuality. So before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. So this is kind of the tip of the iceberg of what Pratitya Samutpada is about. There are so many things in our life that really require an entire community to support the kind of lifestyles we all have. And if we think about it very carefully, we begin to realize that, as an old poet said, no man is an island. We all need one another. So this is the basic truth of reality. So in terms of this notion of truth, there are 2 levels of truth. there's this tip of the iceberg that I mentioned. That's what we tend to fixate on. But there's also this deeper meaning, which is what Martin Luther King is pointing out on what is found in this notion of Pratitya Samutpada. So literally, this term satya means a form of statement regarding what we experience. So there's Samvriti satya, which is common or ordinary statements. So these are like the perceptions that we talked about, as if phenomena were real. So these are actually what we call samsaric perceptions of those who are asleep. The consensus reality, everybody agrees that this is what it's like, but as one of my students told me, if you're not on Facebook, you don't exist. And I think some people actually believe that. Well, I guess I don't exist because I'm not on Facebook. So this is very narrow, egocentric, task-driven kind of attention. It's a partial view of reality. So nobody's saying that there is no such thing as Facebook. There is that social media option that people very often like to make use of. But that's just part of reality. There's so much more going on. And that's what Buddhism is asking us to explore. And that's what's called Paramartha Satya. The correct dogma, don't like use the word dogma here, but that's what the dictionary says, or the averment of the enlightened. So the average person who is considered asleep has a very different way of looking at reality than a person who is enlightened. One of them sees a very narrow range of reality. The other has an expansive, sweeping view of reality, which includes this all allocentric stimulus attention, the full view of reality. So we all are conditioned to the common view of truth, but we really need to exercise our great doubt and ask serious questions about what everybody just assumes to be real so that we can experience the full range of reality. So there's the tip of the iceberg, but so much more underneath the surface. Language is part of that tip, by the way, which is why Buddhism speaks of non-conceptual valid awareness. There is an awareness of reality that cannot be conceived, cannot be put into thought, and also cannot be put into words. That doesn't make it invalid. It just means that we have a need for other forms of communication. So initially there's this sense of dualism. So that we talked already about this entry stage of Buddhist practice, which is great faith. One of the teachings of early Chan is mind is Buddha. But the Chan master who taught this actually said that this is the medicine for sick people. This is what people who are beginning to study Buddhism need to hear. Oh yeah, your mind is the same as the Buddha. So you're looking for this other power, this big brother, somebody out there, the Buddha, who's going to come and save you. Because that's what you think you need. So that's the skillful teaching that the master will give you in the beginning. But then they move you to the next stage, which is great doubt. So this Chan master started teaching the students who had gone along with mind is Buddha. Then he says, oh, no mind, no Buddha. This is the cure for people who are sick because of the medicine. That you overdose on the idea that mind is Buddha, which makes you dependent on this authority, and therefore you have to reverse it with this contradictory statement, no mind, no Buddha. So you'll stop the addiction to that medicine. So here we've got those two extremes. People want something nice and cozy and comfortable and easy. And then the master has to point out, well, actually it's a lot more complicated than that. But this is not the end. There is one more stage. So everybody see the difference between these two. Just when you get comfortable, that's when the master brings in this cognitive dissonance and forces you to rethink what you thought you knew, to reevaluate your perceptions. And here he's actually talking to monastics, so people who are, highly trained. So the next stage, the final stage, is going to be the great death of delusion. So people expect or want to hear that it's easy, that the Buddha is going to give us this map to enlightenment. We assume that it's accurate and there is the destination. It's all mapped out. All I have to do is follow what the Buddha told me. But when you get to the great doubt stage, basically what the master is saying is burn the map, because you're becoming dependent on the testimony of the Buddha. What you thought was a map that was going to get you there, it actually was just motivation. It was an inspiration. Don't get hung up on the map. So that's why you need to not just look at the finger pointing at the moon, but you want to look at the moon directly. So that's the direct truth, which initially people are confused by. So this is the great death of delusion, or the great death of the construct of self. This is the direct awareness that cannot be encompassed in language. And Zen Master Hakuin has this, they call it Enzo, a Zen depiction of this, which also has a poem attached. And the poem says, "Forget yourself and become the universe." So the price of entry into awakening is to leave aside the construct of self. But if you told that to the person at the great faith stage, they'd probably scream and run away because they're not ready for that. It's a step-by-step process. First, invoke faith, then confront them with doubt so that they can have their own experience of truth directly. So we'll be talking quite a bit more about the great death, especially in Chan. So no view is seeing which can see all things. If one has any views about things, this is not seeing anything. This is from the Avatamsaka Sutra, a Mahayana text. So the view that mind is Buddha, the view no mind, no Buddha, those are still views. It's only in the great death stage that we go beyond all views. So any view is not seeing. It is not direct. So that's why we have a rather rare instance of non-dualism as the basic philosophy of Buddhism. In Great Death of Delusion, we talk about the mind of no mind, non-stuck thinking, non-discriminating mind, not dependent on the authority of the Buddha. And this is also the middle way between the extremes of the mind is the Buddha, no mind, no Buddha. Those are two extremes. Mind of no mind is the view of no view. So Buddhist non-attachment is neither fixed on delusion nor in denial. So if you're deluded by great faith, then you're just stuck at that point. You're completely attached to the Buddha. What you want is non-attachment, but non-attachment is not denial. So this is actually from a Japanese Buddhist shrine. It's one of the earlier examples of the three monkeys: see no evil, say no evil, hear no evil. What's wrong with these monkeys? Actually, this is supposed to make fun of this kind of saying. If I see no evil, does that mean that evil no longer exists? If I block my ears, does that mean that evil things are not being said? So they represent a kind of detachment. You want to detach yourself from the reality of evil by not looking at it, not talking about it, and not listening to it. But it's still there. So Buddhism says, no, just don't get attached to it. Yes, there are things out there that are misunderstandings, but you can't run away from them. That's why you can't detach yourself from the world. You have to go back into that world and help people who are deluded. So again, a very profound philosophical statement just using a bunch of monkeys. So the three Dharma seals, these are the characteristics of reality: impermanence, change is taking place. We've already talked about this one, that there is not this notion of a ego self, as a single, separate, independent identity, because we're connected to everything else. And nirvana as extinction or cessation, or putting out the flames of Tana, the flames of the burning world that we looked at last time from the fire sermon. So these are some of the ways in which some of the terminology that is used to discuss our experience of reality. So at the center here, you've got what are called the three poisons: desire, hatred, and delusion. Why is it that we have these misconstrued perceptions of reality and of ourselves? Because of desire, hatred, and delusion. These are not part of our nature. So Buddha nature does not contain desire, hatred, and delusion. These are external sources. These are poisons that prevent us from seeing reality clearly. The next circle here represents what they call the six realms. The heavenly realm, the realm of the Asuras or the Titans, the realm of the hungry ghosts, the hell realm, the animal realm, and the human realm. I'm going to take a look at a philosophical way of interpreting those. And then the 12 links, starting with ignorance, dispositions, consciousness, name and form, six sense fields, contact, feeling, desire, appropriation, becoming, rebirth, aging, and death. So this is how we get sucked into this misperception of reality. And it's all being held by the god Yama, death. You see how he's hanging onto it tightly. So all of this is actually part of our deluded view of reality. That's not how reality is. So these are the three poisons. Attachment is represented by the rooster. That's greed or lust. Anger or hatred is the snake, aversion. And ignorance or delusion is the pig, confusion. So it's sort of like the junk food for the mind. Junk food for our body is salt, fat, and sugar. The more people put them into the products, the more we crave them. And you need each of those, but you don't want to overdose on them. So these are the external sources of errors. Why do we have these misguided perceptions of reality? Either it's because we are attached to something, we want something, we want to possess it, or we want to avoid something, we want to become completely detached like our monkeys, or we are just plain confused. We're not quite sure what we're doing. So the six realms, from a philosophical position, can be looked at as states of mind. So sometimes Buddhist practitioners talk about them as if they are actual realms or even parts of the universe. But philosophically speaking, remember the Dalai Lama talked about the epistemological core of Buddhism. It's really all about how our mind is being fooled and misrepresents reality to us. So we're going to look at some contemporary examples to go along with the traditional examples of each of these. For example, divas. Talk about divas. Literally, it means gods and goddesses, but we also have divas in popular culture, don't we? So here's the traditional depiction, and here's some contemporary depictions. And it sounds like being a diva would be a great thing. So here's where the perception problem comes in. But the problem of being a diva is that you might fall into the weakness of prideful pleasure. You just kind of get stuck at that level and you're not really interacting with reality. You're living in this bubble. comments about that? Is it really that easy to be a diva? Any divas out there? So from the outside, it looks like a wonderful life. And in the Buddhist mythology, if you're in the diva realm, you can be there for countless eons. But the thing about being a diva, you can't become awakened as a diva because you're stuck in such a wonderful environment that you're not giving the impetus of dukkha. It's just too much of two good things, and you're just wallowing in it. So it's not really everything we think it is. And then we have the Asuras. He's been here for years, okay? It's not a recent addition. These are literally the demons or the titans. We talk about the titans of industry, for example, in American culture. And this is a more traditional version of the Asuras. So they have a weakness of anger and jealousy. So they look like they're very strong and very powerful, but they're actually lacking in complete confidence. And that's why they have to put on the show of anger because they're jealous. They're constantly trying to promote their own sense of identity. And therefore they can become violent. And then there's the non-human animals. So yes, it could be literally non-human animals, but there's also human beings who degrade themselves to that kind of basic level. So the weakness here is stupidity and oppression. Spring break. You know, I picked this example, this picture, because somebody thought that this is what spring break is all about. I'm not saying that people go on spring break are necessarily some kind of a lizard, but somehow in their mind, they thought that that was appropriate. Is that what it is? So you go on spring break in the old days, it's just feeding your animal instincts. Hungry ghosts. Well, again, a traditional example, and I think maybe The Walking Dead could be a contemporary example. Insatiable craving. Too much is not enough. They always want to have more, and they can never be satisfied. Hell dwellers. Dwelling in hell is a very violent place, so you're subjected to violence. So hell seems to be another realm, but for some people, the life that they have to lead today really is a living hell. This example, contemporary example, is a depiction of the concentration camps during World War II. That was a living hell. But unfortunately, there are people around the world who, because of war or the pandemic, are living a kind of a hellish life right now. So these 12 causes of delusional misreading of reality, this would be that outer circle that we saw that Mara was chomping on, starting with ignorance. We act out of our ignorance. We develop a sense of separate consciousness, and then we start using names, concepts, and form. Start putting labels on things. Then we use our five senses to edit or interpret reality, which puts us into contact with the external world, and we want to manipulate it. That leads to further sensation. Sensation leads to desires. Desire leads to clinging. Clinging leads to existence and becoming. So this is where the idea of reincarnation is often brought in. And so we experience birth, and if you're born, then you're going to experience old age and die, and then the cycle begins again. All because of how we are misinterpreting the world around us, not seeing clearly. Stuck on the tip of the iceberg. So any questions about that so far? Some of the basic terminology and concepts that we find throughout Buddhist schools. So here we have the major schools of Buddhism. These are known as the vehicles, the yanas, literally yanas. that takes you somewhere. So the schools are a means to an end, and the end would be awakening. So they have certain elements in common. So they all believe in what are called the three treasures or three refuges. That would be the Buddha, the Buddha's teaching and the Dharma, and the community of the Sangha. They generally agree on certain basic texts, a collection called the Tripitaka, literally the three baskets. The original texts were written on leaves and strung together and stored in baskets. That's where the name comes from. So this would include suttas, sutras, Vinaya, and Abhidharma. Later on in Mahayana and Vajrayana schools, they added more texts. But the Tripitaka still is the core that all three schools recognize. So samsara is the common sense reality of phenomena, appearances. So that's the provisional truth we talked about, tip of the iceberg. Nirvana is what we might call the really real noumenal realm of the transcendent truth. So we have to go deeper to experience that. So these are some images that several of them suggested by students in the past. The Theravadan school is known as the Old Wisdom School, or the Way of the Elders, so the original followers of the Buddha, also known as the first turning of the wheel. So we could see it as raw almonds, or the first automobile, or as a slow-moving tortoise. Elderly, they live, in some cases, hundreds of years. This became dominant in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Influence by China, Buddhism in Vietnam combines Theravada and Mahayana, so it's an interesting combination. This form of Buddhism has a strict hierarchy between monastics, which are usually restricted only to men, who are on the express lane to awakening, and then the lay people who are the financial support for those in the monasteries. So there's kind of a separation made. So the lay people support the monastics, hoping that they can be reborn in conditions where they too can become monastics. So the assumption is only monastics can become awakened.
Professor,
Yes.
what were the conditions at birth that would allow someone to go on to become a monastic?
Anybody theoretically could become one. Early on, it was assumed that because of economic conditions that usually only privileged people could do that. In Buddhist families, it became kind of accepted that your eldest son would go on and continue the family business, whatever it was. And then if you had other children, that they could be used to be sent off to the monastery so they could spend their life praying for your good karma, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But for the Buddha himself, yeah, anybody he never rejected anyone for membership in the Sangha.
Were females allowed that time?
At the time of the Buddha, there was a discussion because some of the monks did not want women to become monastics. But the Buddha said, no, they can. And so in India, originally there was a school for a Sangha for the women as nuns and for the men as monastics.
And even after they were accepted, they had to be separated from the males, right?
Well, that was the concern because of social conditions. They were worried about the safety of the women if they were living alone. So in many cases, for example, Fo Guangshan that I visit in Taiwan, it's on 5 mountains, and one of the mountains is reserved for the women, for their nuns, and the other mountain, second mountain is reserved for the monks. But they share common spaces together.
Oh, okay.
So that out of practical necessity, the women needed some form of protection so they wouldn't be, attacked by men who said, "Oh, look there's these women all by themselves, and we're just gonna become predators."
Have they been attacked, or it was just a concern?
There were cases in the literature, the early literature, where nuns who are out there on the road, trying to go and do their Dharma talks, are confronted by men who are not thinking in a Buddhist kind of way, let's say. So it was it was an actual problem that they had to deal with.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So Theravadins are sometimes referred to as Hinayana, but that's a term that is used by the Mahayanas, the next school of Buddhism. So it's not considered appropriate if you happen to be a Theravadin. So they believe in the three characteristics of reality: impermanence, non-self, and dukkha, dysfunctionality, as we talked about it. So samsara in this form of Buddhism is viewed as distinct from the true reality of nirvana. So they use the imagery of two shores separated by a river. So we start on the shore of samsara, and then we need to get to the other side, and we take the vehicle of the Dharma to move from the samsara side to the nirvana side. So the Dharma becomes our vehicle or means of transformation towards complete sense of reality. So the main text, the Dhammapada commentaries, Jataka tales, which are supposedly the past incarnations of the Buddha. So the second school is Mahayana, and that's the one that starts in India, but has a much broader audience that it's trying to relate to. So it's involving a much larger investment of the lay people. So one of the students thought of the trolley as an example of that, because it's a mass transit kind of vehicle. It's not individual seeking of awakening, but going as a group. And instead of our raw almonds, then we have this delicious looking almond torte, because there's this beautification, let's say, of the message, particularly the literature of Buddhism in this period of time, using now Sanskrit, when earlier on they used Pali. So mass transit model, important roles for lay people, including women, becomes dominant in East Asia, so China, Korea, Japan. It includes the schools of Chan, Sun, and Zen, and one of the distinctive things is they start talking about multiple Buddhas in the Mahayana literature, Buddhas predating the historical Buddha or Shakyamuni Buddha. So it does originate in India between 100 BCE and 100 CE, and it was seen as a reform movement. So they're actually saying, well, you know, you've kind of lost the original message of the Buddha, so we want to go back to exactly what the Buddha was talking about, which is awakening for all. So they saw kind of a degeneration in the institutionalization of Buddhism. So the focus now becomes the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, who's going to postpone personal awakening to help others. So they put a lot of emphasis on the universal potential for Buddhahood, not just restricted to this elite group of monastics, but something that is really possible for all beings, not just human beings. So these are some of the major bodhisattvas. So we have Samantrabhadra. You can always tell he's riding on this white elephant. He represents practice. Avalokitesvara, who represents compassion, and starts out as a kind of a male form in India, and when it moves over to East Asia, it takes on a female form. So that's why you see in China, Korea, and Japan, Avalokitesvara has that female form, and this is one of those. Manjusri got the sword of wisdom that we talked about last time, always rides on a lion. And these are some of the major Buddhas. So we've got the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni. We've got Amitabha, the Pure Land Buddha, and Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. Now, the Chinese version looks well-fed, let's say.
That's one question.
Yes.
The Buddha of the future, isn't that also the laughing Buddha, or that's different?
There's different forms it comes in. So this is one depiction.
Oh, do you know who I'm talking about? The laughing Buddha?
Yeah, the
It's also
laughing
like-
Buddha. Historically, people think that it refers to a monk, a Chinese monk, and he was a very nice person, very, very kind to others, and so they referred to him as a Buddha. And he kind of looks more like the plumped up Maitreya over here. And he was particularly fond of children. So very often he is shown surrounded by children. So there's a lot of kind of legendary history behind Maitreya. Amitabha, it could be seen as a distinct individual, but it also is just representing the possibility in the future of this upcoming Buddha. So it doesn't have to be looked at as just a distinct individual.
Okay, so it's a different person.
Well, every person has the potential to be a Buddha, so everyone could also in a way be thought of as the future Buddha.
Okay, thank you.
So the Maitreya is particularly interesting because the Korean version looks very different than the Chinese version, the one that we're most likely to see. Sometimes you even see statues like that at Chinese restaurants, for example. Main characteristics for Mahayana, first two are two of them are the same of what we saw: impermanence, non-self, but the third one is now emptiness, or shunyata. And so it rejects the literal interpretation of the river and the raft, that we're moving from one place to another place. Samsara is the same as nirvana. The seeming difference only exists within our mind. The deluded mind sees samsara, the awakened mind sees nirvana. So they're really one and the same. And so, again, this is from one of the students. When we get to Vajrayana, the thunderbolt vehicle, which emphasizes sudden power, the almond goes from the raw almond to the delicious almond torte to almond liqueur. The vehicle now becomes being blown out of a cannon because it can be very rigorous to follow the Vajrayana path. And the animal now is represented by a mule, and that's actually suggested by a Vajrayana practitioner. So this is known as the third turning of the wheel, the third continuation of the Buddhist school. So it's sometimes also known as Tantric Buddhism. The notion of the Vajra is a thunderbolt, but also interpreted as the diamond, the weapon of the god Indra, the Hindu god. Uses unorthodox techniques, so that's why the shooting out of the cannon was used by the student, to arouse the sleeper to awaken. So it includes breaking formal rules against things like sexual indulgence, eating meat, and drinking alcohol under the cover of Tantric Buddhism. So when we look at that, students always say, oh, I want to sign up for, this Buddhism. That sounds much more interesting, but actually it's in many ways psychologically dangerous. So it's not as easy as it seems. So the intention is to shock the adherent out of their deluded complacency, which is compared to the shock of being struck by a bolt of lightning. So if that's what you're looking for, then Vajrayana might just be for you. So this is the dominant practice in Tibet and Mongolia, sometimes referred to as Lamaism, although that's by people who say that's not really Buddhism, it's a separate religion. I think there is a philosophical thread that goes through all three of the schools, however. It's known for esoteric practices, psychological probings, and makes great use of the arts as part of its extreme methods. So the Vajrayana view of reality is that you aim the thunderbolt at the heart of samsara, and then you force the exposure of the inner nirvana. So it's not just saying samsara is the same as nirvana, but I'm going to do something extreme to show nirvana that exists within samsara. So it's an unmediated encounter with our psychological constructs and passions. So there's our thunderbolt going right through the middle. So we've got the basic material, but presented in different ways. Almonds in different forms. Yes?
Going to the previous slide about the thunderbolt
Yes.
strategy, can you give an example of what exactly is this talking about?
Well, I'll give you one example of a very famous Tibetan master. As he was being trained by his master, the master told him to take these building blocks. I think there were just a bunch of stones, and to build a house out of them. So he spent years doing that. And then just as he had finished and the master came to look at it, the master said to him, okay, now take it apart. And he spent the next few years taking it all apart. That was part of his training. Psychological
But
pressure.
And that propelled him into nirvana?
Well, one of the things that is very important is to move from the great faith to the great doubt. So he had great faith in the teaching of the master. So all he had to do is do exactly what the master told him, and he's going to become awakened. And that's what he did. He built that building out of those rocks. And then when the master tells him to unbuild it, he does the same thing. And eventually he got the point that the master can't do it.
He goes through an extreme psychological discomfort or stress, and that changes his condition. Okay.
So finally he just lets it go. I'm not going to do this anymore. This is crazy. And of course, that's what he was supposed to figure out. But it took many years. So we've got different animals that we could associate with this. So the hermeneutics of the Dharma is, how do you deliver the message? That's the hard part. Hermes was the messenger god of the ancient Greeks, and the text as a messenger is not the same as the message. So that's why the text is important, but it's not the complete message. So the message the Buddha was trying to convey was the awakening experience. But that awakening experience became embedded in the text. At the time that the Buddha was doing his dialogues, he did not allow people to write them down. He specifically said, don't do that. Not many people were literate at the time, but he wanted them to listen carefully. And very often when you're taking notes, you're not listening completely. You're losing a lot. So it was only, again, hundreds of years after he died that they actually violated his instruction and started writing them down. And so we have these texts, but we have to look at them as just a means to an end. They're not the end of themselves. So there are the speeches of the Buddha, his lectures, written versions, which are the texts. Practical guidelines is a whole series of texts that talk about how to organize the Sangha. And then, as we mentioned, there's the commentaries. And these have all been compiled in something called the Buddhist Canon, the Great Storehouse Classic, Daizokyo in Japanese. I actually have it in my dining room. It's 100 volumes. Each volume is about, 1,000 pages. So there's a lot of text. Some of them are originally in Chinese, Korean, Pali, Tibetan, Mongolian, Japanese. Some of them are philosophical treatises. Some of them are simple stories. And what's very interesting, there are non-Buddhist texts included. Indian texts that are not Buddhist, Manichaean texts, Nestorian Christian texts, they're all contained in what is known as the Buddhist canon. So 100 volumes, over 2,000 texts divided into 24 sections. So that's our official time. And actually, we're at the end. The jewel is in the heart of the lotus. So we can take up the meaning of the jewel in the heart of the lotus, the Om Mani Padme Hum, next week. Any questions people have here? So at the very end here is our haiku essay question that I showed you at the beginning. So based on this additional data that you've acquired this week, what do you now see or perceive as Buddhism? And then what does it mean? What is the meaning of that definition of Buddhism, and what's significant about it as a philosophy?
So Professor, this PowerPoint is already posted in Canvas?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
It's under the module with today's date. Other questions? or concerns people have. Let's check our chat.
Do you know if we'll be talking about the Shambhala teaching at all?
Shambhala teaching in what sense?
Well,
Shambhala is
they,
a publishing
well,
house.
right. Well, because they have a specific way. It's like the actual application, I believe, or something like that.
Well, a lot of the Dalai Lama's texts are published by Shambhala, and we are going to be looking at the Dalai Lama's philosophy. Yes. So in that context, yes, we will be looking at that.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, so if you have any questions about the commentary or the haiku essay, just let me know. I also am going to be holding my office hours, virtual office hours on Monday between 11 and noon if you need any help. Otherwise, you can contact me through email. I'm not going anywhere this weekend. I'm going to be right here. So have a nice short holiday.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes,
Thank you, Professor.
you're welcome. Yes, somebody had a question? No, thought somebody had a question?